Hi. Thank you for joining us. I should probably have said howdy. One of the happiest moments in my life was when a Nobel Prize winner on our campus, who was from the East Coast originally, I think, but when he came, I don't know what, 10 years or so ago, the Nobel Prize winner said to me, Patty, I've been meaning to tell you, I wanted to tell you, I've shifted and I now say howdy instead of hello. I thought, very powerful effect the West has on people. It's great. And on Nobel Prize winners, so just citing his authority. So this is really a pleasure. I'm so happy to be here and really enjoyed having the chance to get acquainted with your book. And I wanted to just give everyone a sense of why this is something that we wouldn't necessarily have seen coming 50 years ago. So the book, when I was in graduate school, the book, which was the overview of Western American history, was called, what was it called? The Westward Expansion. And somewhere between the third and the fourth editions, coming into the 1960s, I guess, or moving into the late 60s, someone said to the author that he really might think that there were women in the West, that might be something to think about. And so what that produced is so funny. I almost brought this little litany, but it takes too much time. I went through and I found all the sentences in his book where he simply added, and women. He changed nothing in the content. And it's a wonderful, I might send it to you because you would love it. Actually, you would have a great time doing this because you can have the audience participate with you.
I'd love that.
So
yes,
you read
absolutely.
the sentence and they say, and women, and then you go to the next thing. So I will send,
You're on. I'm there.
You can really use that.
I'm absolutely there. You have to invite me next year, and I'll come back and we'll do it.
True,
We'll do a two-woman show.
You might want to do it in book promotions. Though.
Yes, lovely.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely
just trying to promote your book is all I'm trying to do. Here. So,
every time.
Okay, so this is really a pleasure to be here because again, 50 years ago we didn't see anything except a conjunction and a noun was what was going to happen. There, so we are way past that because this is indeed a really, really fine writer here. So I'm wondering if you could tell us just what road, since there's a lot in trails here, I think I can say that, what trail you traveled to this topic. Was it straight and linear? I'm going there by the time I'm a particular life stage I want to write about this subject, or is the trail winding, the notion of writing about women in India, British women in India, that's an interesting way to
definitely have to invite me back again to do that book. Was it linear? I've spent the last many decades writing about women's history. I don't really like the term women's history because history is history. Why should it be women's? It's not men's history. Why should it be women's history? But, because it's not just in the, histories of the West that you have this happened, and there were some women. Or the other thing that I have is, so-and-so and so-and-so named men and their wife. So I've quite deliberately throughout said so-and-so, Narcissa Whitman, for example, and her husband. And it's quite extraordinary what difference that makes. So that's my little kind of joke to myself. So I've spent the last 20 or 30 years writing books, trying to bring women's stories, not to eradicate men's history, but just to say, hey, actually it wasn't just and women. These were the women, and these were their stories, and they have names, and they had experiences of their own, and quite often they wrote things down, and actually it's really interesting, and it's much more interesting if you expand history to contain their stories. So the women of the West, it came, I did two, this is a bit technical, a two-book deal with my publishers, and one was this book about India, and the other was a book about women in the West. And the reason for the women in the West was that, well, I grew up watching Westerns, and I shouldn't think there's a single person in this room who didn't grow up watching Westerns. We all grew up watching Westerns. And they're these really male, They're great stories. I've got nothing against them, but they're very, very male. The outlaws, gunslingers, bank robbers, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. We've all seen them, and it's such a male world. There are almost no women in them. There may be the odd saloon girl, the odd woman with a murky past who sachets around in a saloon bar, but I figured that there had to be more women than you ever saw in those westerns. So I had this idea that I was going to write a book which was going to be about the Wild West, but with some girls, and it was going to be, the history of the women. But then, obviously, it expanded, and it became something very different from that. It became, when I looked into it, I looked into the history of it, how the West of America came to be America rather than either Mexico, which a lot of it was to start off with, or Indian territory, which the Great Plains were, where only Native Americans, where hardly any white people had been. I realized it wasn't a story about, the Wild West is a construct of Hollywood, isn't it? It was a story about migration. It was a story about how America came to be America, and you couldn't have settlers without women. There were men before, but they were traders and trappers, the odd missionary maybe, but they were only there they were only there for the season. They then went back, they had their families back east. So it was only when people began to settle, for better or for worse, and brought the women along, women and families with them, that the West could be properly settled. So, it wasn't just a male world, it was a profoundly female world. They had a huge role to play in it. And I couldn't find anything that really told me about those women. Or not enough, anyway, not as much as I wanted to hear.
Well, and you have such a diverse cast of characters, and you have an efficiency that I would hope to cultivate, though it's kind of late in my life to do that, but of saying exactly what you wanted to say and then not thinking, oh, for heaven's sake, there's 14 other interesting aspects of this woman's story. You're giving a pretty complete, we meet a person, but you know when to say, that'll do it, on to the next person.
Yes.
So that you don't end up thinking, oh, this is supposed to be about women of the West, and it turned out to be one, and it's a biography, and it goes on and on. So yeah. I'd like to hear just a little bit about how that discipline works for you, because I'm assuming you probably got enchanted by just about everybody.
Yes, just about everyone. I could have, you could write an individual book about almost all the main characters, but there's a lot of history in the book. There's a lot of history about how the West came to be the West, but I tried to use that chronology, if you like. So starting with the book starts in 1836 because that was the year when the first two white women made the journey from what was then the frontier, so what was then the Mississippi and the Missouri River, roughly speaking, all the way across to what was then Oregon country, because they wanted to go and convert the Cayuse. And then from there, it was thought to be a completely impossible journey for women to undertake, and it was to a foreign country. Actually, do you think this might be a good time to just have a map? Yeah, I think could we have the first slide?
The only thing I was going to say as a transition is that you also do very well in not getting overcome by how much historical context each woman has. Oh, right. So you could have had a wheelbarrow-sized book.
Yes, I could. I could have written many, many, many volumes. But right. I don't think people were going to read many, many volumes. That's my thing. I always try to keep my readers in mind. I think I'm a historian, but I'm not an academic like yourself. So what I've tried to do in all my books is to read all the scholarship, to read all the academic works that, frankly, only academics, generally speaking, will read. No offense, and to try to put it in a way that is, people are going to want to curl up with it by the fire and actually read it and take it with them to bed because they are gripping stories, and they are really gripping stories. So I try to kind of not exactly disguise the heavy history stuff, but I try to make the heavy history stuff be there, so it's there like the kind of scaffolding underneath these stories. But then I chose... just to go back to what you were saying earlier, I chose the individual women because they illustrated a particular moment in that history. You know, this is a chronology. So that's how I came to do it. Okay.
Not only are you so scrupulous in getting people placed in time, but you are also very much placing your readers in space.
Yes.
And I, of course, am wanting to know if you dreamt of these places while you were writing.
Did I dream about them? I was obsessed by them.
Okay, that's the word I was
obsessed
after.
by them. To the degree, I'll come onto this map in a minute, to the degree that so the book is the book was published in England last year, and it was published here in the States last autumn, about a year ago. So it's published quite a while ago. And I did, when I was doing the research, I did a trip along the California Trail with my husband in 2019. But I was obsessed by the fact that I had not actually done the Oregon Trail. I'm going to show you where the Oregon Trail is in a minute. Having read all these accounts of the Oregon Trail, I absolutely had to see it for myself. So before I came here to Boulder, I spent 3 weeks with my husband doing another 2,000-mile-long journey in a car to go all the way along the Oregon Trail so I could see for myself what it was like. Now I'm going to get onto the map. So I've got a screen in front of me, so I don't have to turn around. So I thought that a lot of you here will already know this, and my apologies if this is very kind of basic geography for you, but I didn't really understand this until I started to think properly about doing this book. 1836, the year that these first two white women made the journey, this is what America looked like. So the dark parts that you can see, that was the United States. So it was about a third of the landmass that it is now. Mexico was double the size that it is now. It included all of California, all of Texas, all of Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and little bits of Wyoming, I think. The Pacific Northwest, the other pale bit on the far top left that you can see, which is now Oregon and Washington and bits of Idaho, was called Oregon country, and it was disputed land between America and Britain. They hadn't quite managed to, sort it out between themselves. It goes without saying, but this was the traditional land of many, many hundreds of Native American tribes, but these were white guys, slugging it out between them. So that third of what is now the United States was either unsettled by anybody or it belonged to somebody else. It belonged to Mexico. The pale grey bit in the middle was known as Indian Territory, which was the part of America which was under the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, was sold, quote unquote, to the American government by Napoleon Bonaparte. It was this massive area, 530 million acres or something of land, sold by Napoleon to the American government for something like 3 cents an acre, so absolutely rock-bottom price, because he didn't want the British to get their hands on it. So that was Indian Territory. So
it's funny to hear you say that in a British accent, is all I'm going to say. It's just...
Would it have been better or worse if he'd sold it to the Britain? I don't know. One of those counterintuitive things. So when... Oh. Who's calling? Don't worry. It's your mum. Usually it's my mum who calls me in the middle of this. Oh, okay. So the dotted line shows you the journey that these two women did in 1836, and it was considered impossible for any white woman. Obviously, lots of Native American women had done it, but no white women had done this journey because it was just too tough. And when they went, they were going to a foreign country. They were not going to America. They were going to a foreign land, and they had to get passports from the United States War Office in order to go. So that's what it was like in 1836. Could we have the next picture, please? In 1880, just over 40 years later, this is what America looked like it does today. And that enormous pale grey area, which was Indian Territory, has been reduced down to this tiny little, strange little kind of dog leg, which is now Oklahoma. So it didn't even remain Indian Territory for much longer. It was in about the 1890s, I think, wasn't it, that it became Oklahoma. So this was a whole-scale invasion of another country and an area which was just a vast, beautiful place where something like 300 different tribes of Native Americans lived, and which was roamed over, by the way, by these huge herds of bison or buffalo. 30 million of these animals roamed the Great Plains, and all the emigrants have these extraordinary accounts of these huge herds of bison, 100,000 strong, 100,000 animals in one enormous herd, roaring over these plains. There was one that was something like 10 miles long and 3 miles across, and this wagon train was delayed by several hours to watch this enormous herd of bison go past. And by 1880, the time when this map is extant, no Native Americans were living freely on their own land. They'd all been forced into reservations, and the bison were extinct. They'd been hunted to extinction. So, almost.
Ted Turner comes to mind at this point.
Ted Turner comes to mind. Okay, a few in the north, down in the south. I think, weren't they extinct? No, okay, nearly extinct. They were not very. There were so few that all the Native Americans were pretty much starving to death, weren't they?
Right, absolutely. The hunger issue is that's unquestionable.
And I tell this just to show you how incredibly quick it was. I mean, this was within 40 years. We're very, very, very fast indeed. And it was, I think it's an extraordinary endeavor, because on the one hand, these people were hugely resilient. I won't say they were brave exactly, but they were enormously resilient and resourceful. And, these were families who were just wanting to do the best by their, they were, from the women's point of view, they were just looking after their families. But at the same time, it was brutal, truly brutal.
Yeah. Well, and I so appreciate that's fast.
It's a blink of an eye in historical terms.
And there was Thomas Jefferson thinking it would take generations.
Absolutely.
Oops.
Yeah, absolutely. And it took what did he say? It was going to take 100 generations.
It was an enormous number. I can't remember what it was exactly, but
many, many generations. Right. And in fact, it took 4 or 5. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was so fast. It was extraordinary. It was extraordinary to contemplate that, and it was these people moving across from so the frontier was declared no longer in 1990. There was no frontier left because it all moved across.
So we're having this interesting set of opportunities here. Okay. And do you have more maps you want to?
No, not really. I think great. It's interesting to see maps. Because it just kind of roots it in the reality. Yeah.
Right. So our moments here are interesting because I am a deviant academic.
Okay.
And I'm an anomalous academic, and I go outside the boundaries, and I try to reach wider audiences, and so on. And yet, boo-hoo, I must just be dyed in the wool here as an academic. So there's when you speak of the brutality and the sort of innocence of the motives, I want to take us for a visit, just very briefly, to the world of Western American history as academics are writing it. Okay. And the phrase that is used every 4.5 minutes at the Western History Association at any conference is settler colonialism. Over and over and over and over. And I do this to mock it, to say it's really not, it's a phrase that is just used so often. Yet, at its core is something that you were just speaking of, that these women did not have, it would be so rare to think of any of them thinking, I would like to live my life disrupting the world of Native people. Not a one of them, really. And what did they do? They were part of a giant population movement that went very fast and disrupted the lives of that. So settler colonialism, I cannot tell you how often that phrase has just been beaten into the ground, but it is to say that's the difference between white women in India and white women in the West. White men and women in India were in posts and isolated and not settlers moving out into India and raising their families and lasting and living in India. In the American West, settlers, families were moving and staying. Some went back. But the white women were the key to that for reproducing.
Absolutely, yeah.
And a wonderful book by a woman named Sylvia Van Kirk, who wrote, and I didn't really late 1980s, about the fur trade in Canada, she made it clear that it was the arrival of white women that enhanced the racism and the subordination of Indian women who had been the wives of the traders before that. Yes. So I am just wanting to go straight to this. I am not wanting you to ever use the words settler colonialism, because it will so put off your audience, and they will be, and they love you, and then they would say what happened to her if you did that. So don't do that. But reckon with this fact that these, many of them very likable, some of them not, many of them very likable people, were part of an enormous demographic change that devastated a whole other complicated set of residents. And sometimes the women knew that, and sometimes they did not even seem to notice. So how do you handle that? And you do talk about Fanny Boyd, you talk about Army wives who clearly knew what was up. So how do you just really personally for a bit, how do you deal with people who are so likable, who are absolutely complicit in devastating a whole group of other people?
It's really difficult.
It's
really difficult.
Yeah, good.
It's really difficult. How do I? By being a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde, I suppose. I mean, I do think certainly I think one of the things that is most kind of distressing about reading these accounts is how brainwashed they all were, not just the women, but the men, were brainwashed into these racial stereotypes about what who the Native Americans were. And they, for example, the prime mover, Narcissa Whitman was the name of one of these first two women who went across in 1836. And she describes going across to Oregon country, as it was then, with her passport, to, teach the savages how they should live. And this is the term that is, used all the time. They're savages, they are heathens, they are sort of completely outside the pale. And I think and also I think people were brought up with these stories. I came across quite frequently stories of women would say, yes, when I was a child, I heard these stories. We would sit round the fire, and my grandmother would tell us stories about how the savages, scalped my great-grandfather or whatever it was. And they were sort of like horrors, like the bogeyman. They were these horror stories that were told to them, which they imbibed with their mother's milk. And so they went across first of all thinking that these people were savages and kind of almost subhuman, so why should we care about them, because they don't, they're not really human beings. And the other, and this is something that I needed to do these trips myself in order to see this terrain. And if you were an immigrant, the chances were that you never saw a Native American. Or if you did, in the beginning, all they wanted to do was to trade with you. So they went terrified, everybody bristling with arms, bristling with weapons, because they thought they were going to be attacked by the savages. But that almost invariably did not happen until the period of the Indian Wars, which was much later. And when they did meet Native Americans, they think, oh my God, well, they just want to, sell us some glass beads or whatever it was. But also, they didn't come across them. This terrain is so immense. I mean, just driving for the last 3 weeks, you would go from one valley into another. These enormous spaces. You would expect to see dinosaurs coming, over them. I mean, it's an extraordinary landscape. And of course, Native Americans didn't settle. They were nomadic people, so there was no evidence of anybody there. So to them, it looked empty. And it wasn't empty. It wasn't their land to take. That goes completely without saying, but I'm just trying to put myself into their shoes. It looked empty for a lot of the time. But you're right, they were complicit in this, and the things that happened were terrible. And for example, in California, after the gold rush, it was a genocide. And they were definitely complicit in that, there's no doubt.
Now we're right where the fights over Confederate monuments and all that stuff, we're doing our Western version of that. Because how do we, these people are dead, so it's too late to bring them to trial. there's a statute of limitations. Not that it would be of any value to do that, but to say we're acknowledging, and this is what I want to get to, is how much attention you have put into making this not just about white women and their perspectives. That's really where we're going with this.
Yes,
it's not
okay.
that we're really planning to bring them back to a trial. We're not going to.
Okay.
But,
Yeah,
but,
no,
but it
difficult.
is troubling to see
It's
that
very
dimension
troubling.
of their lives, and you have been, that weighs on you. So in response to that, you really have worked very hard. I mean, you have an opening right at the start, the complexity of Indian names, tribal names, that you're not going to be just using whatever the terms, pejorative terms that are used. You're going to be thinking very hard about what the tribes, what names they had for themselves. You worked with a professor, a religious studies professor.
Yes, that's correct.
You might
Yeah.
want to tell us a little bit about that,
Yeah.
who coached you, I think, or I don't know what she did, but
she read the manuscript, yes,
Yeah.
a woman. She was not actually...
But she does Indian religious history, American
Yes.
Indian religious history. So you had someone right there. So talk about that.
Well, yes, this was, this is something that's quite, in the writers community, is quite, it's kind of a hot topic, having a sensitivity reader to read your work. And I absolutely, completely welcomed that. And that was something that my publishers, I was going to say, they didn't force it on me. I absolutely welcomed it and wanted it. I'm a British writer. I didn't know very much about Native American history before I started to write this book, and so I worked with this academic in Arizona who's not herself a Native American, but she's married to a Native American, and she read the manuscript and pointed out things that I might have got wrong, and in fact, there wasn't all that much that she suggested, but it was things like, for example, I'd use the word shaman to describe a medicine man, and she said quite correctly, no, shamans are what the people in the Sami people in northern Lapland have, and this is a word that white Western anthropologists have taken and just applied it randomly to every indigenous spiritual leader. So don't use the word shaman, use medicine man or medicine woman. So things like that were incredibly helpful. But one of the things that is difficult, and I don't know what your experience is of this, was that I was very, very keen to not just have the voices of white women. That seemed to me just as much of an error as only having white blokes telling the story, white cowboys telling the story. I didn't want it just to be the white women, although from a historian's point of view, it's so well documented. All these women, white women, all wrote stuff. There's thousands, literally thousands of accounts, so it's a very rich field. So I did work very, very hard to find African-American accounts, which is also difficult because a lot of them were taken as enslaved people, so they didn't or were not able to read and write. And also I tried really hard to find the Native American women to use their accounts like a kind of mirror. So if you can imagine, there was this, 500,000 people streaming across these lands between 1840 and the time when the railway was completed in 1869, many millions more after the completion of the railroads. There is no parity in how many Native American women accounts I have, but I do have enough to have made, I hope, a decent stab at showing their point of view. So there were these women, Native American women, who were experiencing the onslaught of this huge wave of immigration that was coming their way. And there are not very many sources, but the ones I found were really very good. Josephine Waggoner, who is like my heroine. So Josephine Waggoner she was a mixed race woman. She was half Irish. Her father was an Irish, he was a Civil War veteran. He'd kind of drifted into the West after the Civil War. And her mother was a Hunkpapa Lakota woman. Her father died quite young, so she was really brought up as a Hunkpapa. And, for example, Sitting Bull was a Hunkpapa, so her mother was the same tribe as Sitting Bull. And so Josephine, grew up in a very traditional indigenous way, but was later educated in American schools because Native American children were subsequently forced to go to these schools, but she did learn to read and write, which for us historians later on is a great boon. And she was so aware of the fact that all the elders of her tribe and all the related tribes of the Lakota people were dying out, that she spent 20 years of her life in the 1920s and 1930s going round the reservations and finding all these elders and talking to them and writing down their experiences of the Indian War and the various things that had gone on, and also writing her own little memoir of what it was like to grow up. And she tried in her own lifetime, she died in 1949, I think. She tried in her own lifetime to get it printed. No one was interested. Her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren all tried to get these, literally accounts in old exercise books, to get it published. No one was interested. No one thought an American Indian woman's account was worthy to be printed. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it was eventually published in 2013, nearly 100 years after she had first started to go out into the field and collect these stories. So that gives you, that is a perfect encapsulation of how difficult it was for any Native American to be heard, I think, in those days. I don't know how different it may be now.
Well, the records are what we have in terms of the audible, articulate, putting their ideas and thoughts and experiences where we can take them in. That's wonderfully transformed, are the folks now who are just, now maybe the last 40 or 50 years, just writers aplenty on that. But it is, and that's where I think you went way beyond tokenism of, why, here's a page where I'll put in a few quotations. So it's Sarah Winnemucca, you really are taking, but there's only so many things that we can find, and God willing, we keep finding more over time that these things finally do surface. But I thought there was really just an unquestionable commitment on your part to say,
I felt so strongly about it. It was the thing I felt most strongly about in the whole book, and they were so moving, these accounts, apart from anything else. I mean, they're devastating to read, absolutely devastating. Mm-hmm. But they are so necessary to put them in, and I'm very happy to hear you say that, because I tried it very hard to get that right.
So now, just to be an irritating academic, I guess, but really just to point out that the enthusiasm or demands or whatever it is for full diversity, equity, and inclusion can result in tokenism if it's not.
Yes.
So I have no idea. I'm now going to ask you why you did not make a comparable effort of inclusion for Spanish descent Mexican American people.
Okay.
Because, and that's not to say, don't you know we have a checklist and you must do certain percentages of these different groups, although it sometimes feels like that in our odd world today. But I wondered what had happened there that made you so committed to the inclusion of the Native people.
Okay.
And then the Mexican and Mexican American figures, who were, of course, as they say, the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the border crossed them. They didn't cross the border. They were suddenly there in American territory, and their resources, their original sources, are scattered and hard to find as well. But anyway, so what happened there?
Well, I definitely... I do say at the beginning of the book that it's not completely comprehensive. It couldn't, unless it was going to be the 6 volumes that we talked about, it's not, and never could be, and was not intended to be, an absolutely comprehensive history of it, that I was going to confine myself to really just the 2 main routes. So the 2 main emigrant, can I say emigrant? Yes, emigrant routes were the Oregon Trail, which went from the Missouri River up to what is now Oregon, to Fort Vancouver, which is now Portland, and then down to California on a southern route via the deserts of Utah, via Salt Lake City, where all the Mormons ended up, across Nevada to Sacramento and San Francisco. So that was one of the ways in which I was not overwhelmed by material. And yeah, that's all I can say.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, the trail. There are trails that go through New Mexico and Arizona, but those were not the trails you were following.
But those were not the trails. And I did say also specifically that I don't attempt to talk about Texas, which seems to me to be another whole...
That's always a good move. That's always
another whole
very
6
wise,
volumes.
yeah. Right.
Because, that's the reason. I was quite specific. And it was a kind of discipline that I had throughout. Maybe I should write another book. I used to live in Mexico, so it's not...
Did you?
Yes, I did a while, 30 years ago. Oh, God. So, their history is dear to me as well.
Well, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
No, and I appreciate
But,
so much the reminder that you were doing the trails.
Yeah.
And those two trails did not
so
that territory.
that I tried to confine myself to that, because otherwise, where do you stop?
Right.
Yeah, and it was going to be one book, so...
Right.
And I wanted people to read it.
Right. We don't want them...
And not think, oh, this is too heavy. I can't, heavy as in weight.
Right.
I can't lift up this book because it's so long.
Could you tell us about reader response, the impact on audiences that you've had with the book, or is it still early in the game on that?
No, it's not that early. I mean, this is, you are my guinea pigs. I have not given this talk in America before. And so it's mostly, I've been doing this in the UK. I've done it kind of Zoom things, but not to a live audience before. And in Britain, people are amazed by those maps. They're amazed by the speed of it all, as indeed was I. I mean, I had no idea how fast it was, or what the geography meant, so to speak. How it all worked, how America came together. I think people are very ready to hear a more I was going to say a more feminine version. That's not really what I mean. Ready to hear the experiences of women who are, and I think one of the reasons women have been left out in the past is because they're not part of the big events. They're not part of, they didn't fight, they were not soldiers. They didn't actually fight the wars. They may have been there, cheering on the soldiers. They may have been morally sort of complicit, as they were morally complicit in it. They didn't sign the treaties. They didn't, they were... the way I put it is that they stand obliquely to the events that usually make it into the history books. And I think that we're ready to hear what those oblique voices can tell us.
Right. I'm thinking that the British people might have been particularly... would they have been thinking about the Hudson's Bay Company and how important it was in the Pacific Northwest? So you write quite a bit about that.
I would love to think people knew about the Hudson's Bay Company in Britain. I'm not sure. I think people are incredibly ignorant about their history. I mean, Britons are very ignorant. The way it's taught in our schools, we tend to do Tudors and Stuarts, and possibly several times over, and perhaps the causes of the First World War, and the rest is just, and maybe the Reformation, and the rest is just a huge blank. So unless you have a particular interest yourself in history, people are very ignorant about history. And I think people know perhaps a bit about American history. They might know about the War of Independence from Britain, but they don't know much about it.
Well,
so the people who are interested in history are very interested to learn, and that's great from my point of view. And like I said earlier, I think my job is to make history, not to dumb it down in any way, in fact, not at all to dumb it down, but to present it in such a way that you don't have to plough through an academic PhD to get there.
Right. I'm wondering if you might tell them the story about John McLaughlin's wife, because in terms of the incorporation of Indian people, that's quite a story, and the preposterously named minister, and his unpleasant wife.
Yes, well, so what Patricia's referring to is she's a wonderful woman. In fact, she's one of, if I can be said to have a favourite character, she's certainly one of them. Her name was Marguerite McLaughlin. she was married to this man called John McLaughlin, who was the chief factor of the British Hudson's Bay Fur Company. So Fort Vancouver, the little fort on the top left-hand side of the map that I showed you, was a British settlement. And this man John McLaughlin, was 6'4". He had this huge white head of, mane of hair. And he was this very, very energetic chief. He headed up the Hudson's Bay Fur Company. It was a very powerful trading post, in the middle of basically nowhere. And he was married to this woman called Marguerite McLaughlin, who was half Cree. So she was a métisse woman. She was half Cree. Her father had been a Swiss Canadian, and her mother was a Cree from Canada. And so the story that I love is that when the two missionary women, Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spalding, when they arrived at Fort Vancouver after this incredible journey, 5 months across the prairies and the Rocky Mountains, and they arrived at Fort Vancouver, which was the only settlement for thousands of miles in any direction, with this, thinking that they were going to go and teach the savages a thing or two. And the first lady of Fort Vancouver was this Cree called Marguerite McLaughlin. And I went to Fort Vancouver the other day. This was so exciting for me because I'd read accounts of what it was like, but I'd never seen this for myself. And they've done this recreation of what the chief factor's house was like. So the point of the story is that these two missionary women, thinking that they were very superior white women, found the first lady, this Cree lady, who took them in, showed them her house. She lived in this really quite grand house with a mahogany dining table, silverware on the table, lots of beautiful spode, amazing. They've got the best collection of spode in America because all the immigrants brought spode with them. And she sort of took them under her wing, and she completely exploded their ideas of what a Native American woman might be or could be. And they were shown around. She showed them her strawberry beds. She showed them her beautiful house with all this wonderful furniture in it. And the best story of all is that Narcissa Whitman was going to write a letter home. So she was writing this letter. The post went by sea, and it was the last time that she was going to be able to write this letter to her mother to say she'd arrived safely. And she was about to lick the I suppose there was a kind of seal on the envelope, so she was about to lick it, and Marguerite said, "My dear, no, you mustn't do that. It's terribly rude to send spittle to a friend. Here is the McLaughlin family crest, stamp. Here's the McLaughlin family seal and some sealing wax. This is how we do it here." I love that story because it completely put these two women in their place and gave them a lesson in expanded their horizons, let's say. And the beaver, very quickly, so there was a very unpleasant couple who had arrived just before the Whitmans and the Spaldings. Was an Anglican preacher and his wife. And I always thought that this must be the Hudson's Bay Company having a bit of a joke back in London, because this man was called the Reverend Beaver, and of course the main fur that they were collecting was beaver furs. So obviously this is why he'd got the job, because of his name. And so he'd arrived out there, offended everybody, and he had a ghastly wife with him. There was a beautiful description of her. It says that she was a rather fierce-looking, and something what was it? I can't remember exactly. Something to the effect of that she wore the trousers in the marriage. Anyway, they were deeply unpopular, and to the extent that this man, the Reverend Beaver, was terribly upset because, of course, the marriage between John McLaughlin and his wife Marguerite was not a marriage that was done in a church. It was a mariage aux façons du pays. So it was a country marriage. It was a bit like in India, the Indian merchants with their BBs. It was exactly the same idea. They made a sort of informal arrangement some of which worked, some of which didn't. John McLaughlin was devoted to his wife. And so when the Reverend Beaver came along and suggested that she was a woman of ill repute, like she was just a mistress in his view, he very nearly, he had a stick and he was about to thrash this man to within an inch of his life, and someone had to pull him off.
He hit him once, didn't he?
Did he hit him once?
It matters to me.
He should have hit him.
It really matters to me that John McLaughlin hit Reverend Beaver once at least.
Hit him.
He's so deserving.
He hit him once.
Okay.
He did hit him once. But then there's a lovely description of the devotion of this man, John McLaughlin, to his wife, and it says, and I have a picture of Marguerite McLaughlin in the book, and it's not a particularly flattering picture to her. It was taken in her when she was relatively old. But a subsequent emigrant wrote that he was so devoted to her that, how does it go, that he was as devoted to her as if she had been a daughter of Queen Victoria, and his gallantry to her knew no bounds, even when she was old and fat and flabby. His gallantry to her knew no bounds. It's a lovely story. And then, later on, when there was a church in Portland, many years after, they got married in the church. I've seen their wedding certificate. It's a very lovely story.
It was my goal there to give you a reader's experience there of why this book is so full of these moments where you're really there. So now we would like to, and meeting these people who are just beyond anyone's expectations, and he has to have hit him once. He just
did.
has. Okay.
He thrashed him.
Okay,
he definitely thrashed him.
Okay.
He did.
Well, that was not an academic.
No. He thrashed him. It's okay.
Okay, alrighty. So now we're ready. Questions. We have a few minutes for some questions. Oh boy, there you are. You were sort of hidden from us with blinding lights coming at us, but now we see you. So yes, please.
So I got here a little bit late, so I may have missed this, but it sounds like you did all of your research across the ocean. And how was that? Because is everything now electronic?
Well, I live in London with access to the British Library, and the British Library has the best collection of Americana outside of America. It had everything I wanted. I think there was one book about Fort Yuma, a very obscure book about Fort Yuma that I couldn't get, and that was the only thing. And all the the Oregon all the historical society, sort of learned journals, the Oregon Historical Society was a particularly rich source for me. All of those, dating back from the 1920s, I mean, really going back a long way, are all online. So if you have access to, things that are sort of on, I'm also a member of something called the London Library. So through that, I could get all these scholarly journals digitally, and then the books I could get, even really obscure things like accounts by the mountain men, these extraordinary men who went into the Rocky Mountains to trap the beaver fur. Some of them were very literate and educated, and they left accounts, and I found these brilliant books with pages that hadn't even been cut yet. So that was quite exciting to get hold of those. So I didn't feel... I could not have done this book. I don't know how it was for you, writing in 1975 was your book, that if you'd had to go to every individual library, it would have taken decades. It would have been impossible for me. It would have been so expensive to have done it. But now, because of things are available digitally, so it was okay.
Right.
But if I had when I saw these two books, so this book about India and this book about the women in the American West, and it was almost flipping a coin to see which one I was going to do first. If I had done the American one first, I would not have been able to have access to Josephine Waggoner's work,
right,
because her book would not have been published. It wasn't published till 2013. So some genie, some guardian angel was directing the toss of the coin so that I did the India one.
Right, and I will just say that we have so many academics going to the archives, and they write really valuable studies, but then no one puts those together into a larger whole. WHOLE. So,
Yes.
so that you were really doing something that is so missing in the profession of history, where everyone is incentivized to do specialized research, but then who will put those pieces
Together.
and parts together? So that's where being in London might actually have been your...
and also I didn't have, because I was coming to it with quite a fresh eye, I wasn't afraid to go in and tell quite a general story. I mean, you know, I'd say I hope it's as well researched as it could possibly be, but you're right. You know, I would find a book about lawn dresses, you know, a very specialized book, a book about the mountain men you could find, you know, all these different areas, but almost nothing which was great for me, because then I realized that there would be that there was a space for me to come in and pull all these things together and not get too bogged down by detail. I mean, to read all the detail, but then to carefully choose what would be a story, what would be a narrative. So it's the story of this 40-year period when this great migration happened, and some of the most, you know, interesting women who were writing and around in that time, Native American, African American as well.
I have a quick question. Did you also interview any of the descendants of these white women, or...
Do I interview the descendants?
And yes, the descendants,
Oh,
and
okay.
also of the Native American people that you talked about.
Okay.
Well, instead of just by researching books and stuff, did you
Okay.
actually do some interviews with living people today?
I didn't when I was writing the book, because it was, frankly, I was writing it during COVID, and so I was confined to my home during that time. I'd done all the research through written documents, but I'm very, very glad that you asked me that, because I had the most amazing experience on this road trip that I was doing over the last 3 weeks. I was in a place called Sumpter in the Blue Mountains, panning for gold, as you do. And the guy who was showing us how to pan for gold turned out to be the great nephew of one of the women in my book. How about that for a coincidence? Keturah Belknap, who is another one of my very favorites. So she wrote this amazing account of the journey in 1846, I think it was. It was the year before the Whitman massacre, anyway. And so she writes this wonderful stream of consciousness. She wrote exactly as she was thinking. No punctuation, just literally. We're going today, no punctuation at all. It's quite hard to read, but it's very, very vivid. And this man, Earl Bishop, whose wife I'm now in correspondence with, who's sending me pictures of Keturah's grave and clippings of her obituary and all these other things that I obviously can't put in the book because it's published. But isn't that amazing? It was just the most incredible, beautiful bit of serendipity.
So we have one last question and about 1 minute to answer, but thank you.
Quick.
Well, this is kind of a relative of my friend's question. Is there one person or one situation that you would love to transport yourself back to and be there to interview back in the day when it was happening?
Yes, there is. I'm so glad you asked me that as well.
let's
If
hear
I
it.
could go back in time, I would go back to the rendezvous. I would go back to the big fur trade fair in the Rocky Mountains, which was the way in to that route across the land before, sort of pre the emigrant trails. It was the only way, really, that anybody who was not a trapper or not involved in the fur trade could really travel. A white person, I mean, because there was a caravan that went from St. Louis to a certain spot in the middle of the Rocky Mountains, in the middle of Wyoming now, and they would have this trade fair with thousands of people, all the fur trappers, all the Native Americans with their horses and their mules, and it was a sort of bacchanal. It was a, they had horse races, they had wrestling, they had gambling, they had all the liquor that came up with the American Fur Company caravan, and it was like a. In Britain, I describe it as being like Glastonbury, because there was a lot of music as well. There's our big music festival that we have. I guess it would be like Woodstock. It would be like a combination of a trade fair and Woodstock is what it would be like. It was extraordinary. So I would love to go back there.
I just have to say, from this memory from graduate school, from the academic world, so we were hearing a report on the Rendezvous this many years ago, and there was one very, very serious academic in that class with us, and it turns out, as I'm sure we're saying, that the two white women and the fur trappers, well, the white families and the fur trappers didn't get along very well when they were traveling together, and it didn't go well.
Didn't they throw eggs? They threw rotten eggs at Marcus
what we
Whitman.
heard, so we're in
Good
this
riddance.
academic class, we're at Yale, and we hear this report, and this very serious academic. Well, what we were told was, by who was giving the report, that the fur trappers became so angry at the white missionaries that they threw droppings, animal droppings, at them. So that caused this very serious academic to look very serious and to say, "What kind of droppings?" And so we're all like, What has gone on with this academic training? And we laughed and laughed, and this poor man was sputtering away, and he kept saying, "I wanted to know if they were traveling with oxen or with mules." So, oh, well, thank you for that edifying remark. So I think there's nothing better to do at the end of this than to make fun of academics, as I just did with that reminiscence, and to say it's the weirdest relationship, and it seems functional, that some of my people do write for other wider audiences, and that's my whole applied history program, is to get more of that. But the pattern is that academics write books, and then other people come along and translate them so that you can read them. So it's a little bit goofy, but when you get this kind of translator, who's going to complain about that? So thank you for taking that role. It's been really great.